in the German High Command. The shock of losing a well-placed attack by the Messerschmitts sent ripples through their aerial strategies. The Luftwaffe had prided itself on its overwhelming numerical superiority and superior dogfighting tactics, honed in the early years of the war. But the P-51 Mustang, with its speed, firepower, and, most importantly, its skilled pilots, began to unravel this advantage. Johnny's escape represented a new way of thinking, one that broke through the rigid, conventional maneuvers the Germans relied upon. Their arrogance in the air was slowly eroding as the Allies' adaptability proved to be just as deadly as their weaponry. Johnny's maneuver, the roll followed by a sharp dive and climb, was an intuitive use of the Mustang's agility. While most Allied pilots were taught the basics of evasive action, barrel rolls, sharp turns, and quick dives, it was Johnny's timing and execution that set him apart. His understanding of the Mustang's handling characteristics allowed him to exploit its roll rate, which was faster than any aircraft the Luftwaffe could muster. The P-51 Mustang's 900-horsepower Merlin engine made it one of the most agile planes in the skies, and Johnny had learned to use that agility in a way no manual could teach. For Johnny, the maneuver was a last-ditch effort, an instinctive response to being cornered. But for the engineers and tacticians back at Allied headquarters, it became the key to refining their own aerial combat strategy. The Allies began to recognize that the future of air superiority wasn't just about numbers. It was about exploiting the small, decisive moments. It was about creating uncertainty, throwing the enemy off balance, and using the technology at their disposal to force mistakes. As the war raged on, Johnny's maneuver would come to symbolize a shift in the balance of power. It wasn't about getting the highest kill count or the most confirmed victories. It was about survival, about making the enemy question their assumptions. It was about creating doubt in the hearts of the enemy pilots, who had always believed that they held the upper hand in the skies. In the chaos of combat, every second counted, and Johnny's ability to break free from a death trap showed how quickly the tide could turn. The Germans' reaction to this new threat came quickly. Luftwaffe fighter groups began to adapt, learning new tactics in response to the increasing threat of the P-51 Mustang. However, the adaptations were often too little, too late. The Luftwaffe's earlier reliance on speed and precision in their attacks had been challenged. In their desperation, they began to send their pilots into more unpredictable, dangerous situations, trying to counter the growing number of American aircraft that dominated the skies. Their desperation was evident in reports from German pilots, who spoke of their growing confusion when engaging the Mustang, especially when they encountered pilots who, like Johnny, were willing to take risks and defy convention. The most telling response on the German side came from a senior Luftwaffe pilot's diary, which would later be recovered in 1945. "The Americans have become unpredictable," he wrote. "It's no longer a matter of outnumbering them or flying a superior machine. Their pilots have learned to turn our tactics against us. They're no longer fighting as soldiers. They're fighting as shadows in the sky." This statement, made by one of the Luftwaffe's own, was a stark recognition of how the Allies had adapted. The Germans had underestimated the American pilot ability to learn and innovate under pressure. What Johnny had done that day wasn't just about one pilot's survival. It was about the survival of a new philosophy of warfare. In the days following the escape, Johnny's maneuver would be analyzed by Allied commanders and fighter schools, with many pilots seeking to replicate it. Soon, the tactical advantage of surprise, of moving unpredictably, became an integral part of American training. But this wasn't limited to the Mustangs. As American air superiority spread across the European theater, pilots in every branch of the Air Force began employing similar tactics. The strategy was simple. Make yourself the most elusive thing in the sky. Fight not with brute force, but with speed, timing, and unpredictability. A dogfight was no longer just about engaging the enemy. It was about throwing the enemy off balance and keeping them guessing. However, Johnny's success didn't just lie in his maneuver. It was also in the aircraft itself. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was engineered for just such moments. Its lightweight design allowed it to outmaneuver heavier German fighters, while its long-range capability made it the perfect escort for Allied bombers. The Mustang's superior performance, coupled with the American pilots' growing ability to adapt in combat, was the perfect storm for the Luftwaffe. For the Germans, they were facing an opponent that could not be defeated with sheer numbers alone. As the summer of 1943 came to a close, the air over southern Europe was becoming increasingly dangerous for the Luftwaffe. The Allies were gaining ground, and the tactical superiority that the German Air Force once held was slipping away. Johnny's maneuver, a simple but effective evasion, had helped shift the momentum. The Germans, ever focused on firepower and numbers, failed to realize that adaptability, unpredictability, and innovation were just as potent on the battlefield. Johnny Adams would go on to fly many more missions, and his reputation would continue to grow among his fellow pilots. His daring escape from the Messerschmitt swarms, though, would remain a key moment in the history of aerial combat. It was a victory not just of one pilot over many enemies, but a victory of tactics over tradition, of the unexpected over predictable. In the skies above Europe, it wasn't the largest or the most powerful planes that won the day. It was the pilots who knew how to use their machines in ways the enemy never expected. As 1944 dawned, the Luftwaffe's grip on the skies was slipping. The strategic bombing campaigns over Germany had gained momentum, and the Allies' air superiority was becoming more and more undeniable. It was not just the overwhelming numbers of Allied bombers that caused the Germans to fear, but the relentless adaptability and innovation of the American pilots. The maneuver Johnny Adams had executed that summer, which had once been a solitary escape, had now evolved into a tactic used across the European theater. The skies, once a battlefield dominated by the Axis, were now ruled by the Allies, not just because of superior numbers, but because of their ability to change the game at a moment's notice. Johnny's maneuver was the embodiment of this change in strategy, a symbol of how quickly the war in the air had shifted. It wasn't just about the plane you flew or the bombs you dropped. It was about the will to fight in unpredictable ways, to force the enemy to abandon their assumptions and adapt to new tactics. The Americans had proven that ingenuity more than firepower was what truly defined air superiority. July 19, 1943. The sun hung high over the skies of southern Italy, casting long shadows over the expanse of war below. On this fateful day, the roar of engines would cut through the silence of sky, soaked with the acrid scent of burning fuel and the distant clatter of machine guns. It was a day unlike any other for Lieutenant John Johnny Adams, flying his P-51 Mustang on a routine escort mission over the Mediterranean. His task was simple: protect the bomber group as it made its way to the target. But the moment he saw the storm of enemy aircraft breaking through the clouds, all the training, all the preparation, and all the numbers in the world could not have prepared him for what came next. From below, the sound of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 filled the air, sharp, violent, relentless. Within seconds, Johnny was staring down the barrels of multiple enemy fighters, their sleek forms darting like sharks in the ocean, closing in for the kill. The bomber formations were already in chaos, their defensive gunners firing in all directions, hoping to dissuade the swarm that had appeared like vultures on a carcass. Adams, heart racing, had seconds to decide his next move, but his instincts took over as he dove into the thick of the battle. In a mere heartbeat, his mind raced through every maneuver he had ever learned, every aerial combat tactic he'd practiced in the training fields of Britain. It was in that instant, as the first wave of enemy fighters came within range, that Johnny pulled off a maneuver so unexpected, so audacious, that it would haunt Luftwaffe pilots for the rest of the war. His P-51 Mustang, known for its speed and maneuverability, was suddenly a blur in the sky, spinning into an evasive roll, diving into a near-death spiral, before flipping its wings and coming out on the opposite side of the dogfight. The Messerschmitts, accustomed to enemies who follow predictable flight paths, were caught off guard. They swarmed, diving and climbing in frantic attempts to lock onto their target. But Johnny was already gone, invisible to the enemy for just long enough to break away from the pack. This secret maneuver, an unexpected use of the Mustang's unparalleled roll rate and speed, had left the Luftwaffe pilots confused and disoriented, their instinctive pursuit crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. It wasn't just a lucky escape. It was the perfect marriage of skill and machine. What Johnny didn't know then, as he pulled out of that near-death spiral, was at this moment become a case study in aerial combat for years to come, a testament to the raw instinct and tactical genius that could turn the tide of air superiority in favor of the Allies. But as Johnny's Mustang screamed away from the confusion of Messerschmitt's, the danger was far from over. This moment wasn't unique. There were countless such encounters in the skies above Europe, with every pilot forced to improvise, adapt, and survive in a world where seconds meant the difference between life and death. However, the tactical maneuver that Johnny employed wasn't one that would be quickly recognized or adopted by every pilot in the sky. In fact, it was a maneuver born not from doctrine or manuals, but from the mind of a young man who, in that split second, knew that survival often depended on the element of surprise. The skies over Italy, 1943, were a battleground where every inch of ground was contested. The Allies had a single goal: to break the Nazi stranglehold on Europe and open a new front through southern Italy. The Luftwaffe, desperate to keep its hold, sent wave after wave of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs into the fray. The Allied bomber formations were, for all intents and purposes, sitting ducks, heavily relying on their fighter escorts to keep them safe. It was a critical time in the war, and for Johnny, every mission meant another step toward breaking the Axis hold on the skies. At the same time, the pilots of the Luftwaffe were not unfamiliar with the P-51 Mustang. They knew the Mustang's capabilities, its long range, its speed, and its firepower. But what they underestimated was the adaptability of the pilots flying them. They had come to expect the usual, the predictable. Enemy pilots diving, climbing, weaving in attempts to escape. But Johnny's maneuver, something that was not taught in any manual or school, broke that mold. He had learned to use the Mustang's unique features to his advantage, turning a disadvantage, being surrounded, into an opportunity to escape undetected. By the time Johnny pulled out his roll and regained control of his Mustang, the Messerschmitts were in disarray. The Luftwaffe pilots, unable to follow his maneuver precisely, were left grasping for answers in the sky. One by one, they broke off their attacks, their confidence shaken. They had underestimated the American pilot, and that would be their mistake. Johnny, however, was not out of danger yet. As he leveled out, his eyes scanned the sky for any sign of enemy aircraft, but he knew that one maneuver, one moment of brilliance, wasn't enough to guarantee his survival. His job now was to rejoin his squadron, make sure the bombers were still protected, and prepare for the next inevitable wave of attacks. It would not be the last time he would face the Messerschmitts, but he had made one thing clear to them: there was no predictable way to take him down. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe would continue to push its assault on the Allies, but the consequences of that day, of Johnny's escape, would ripple through the air forces on both sides. His secret maneuver would become a reference point for other pilots, a shining example of how quick thinking, innovation, and the right aircraft could make all the difference. The skies would never be the same again. But what Johnny didn't know, as he soared above the clouds with his squadron once again, was how crucial this escape would be in the larger campaign for air superiority over Europe. The Allies were gaining momentum, and in the coming months, battles would unfold that would determine the fate of the war. And in those skies, every maneuver, whether a bold roll or a calculated dive, would have consequences that reached far beyond the individual aircraft. And as Johnny's Mustang flew on, the legacy of that moment hung over the battlefield like a shadow. The Messerschmitts had been fooled, their prey slipping from their grasp. But in the coming weeks, it would not just be Johnny's tactics, but the overall might of the Allied air forces that would change the course of the war. The world was on the edge of transformation, and the skies were the proving ground. In the weeks that followed Johnny's narrow escape, his reputation among the Allies grew. However, the real story of what had happened that day in July wasn't just about one pilot or one lucky break. It was about the evolution of aerial combat. Johnny's maneuver had showcased the value of unpredictability, a trait that would come to define Allied air tactics in the skies over Europe. What made his escape so remarkable was not just his flying skill, but his instinct to break the mold. The Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to predictable tactics, were left scrambling in the wake of his daring roll. And it wasn't long before Johnny's tactics would be analyzed, dissected, and adopted by other pilots on both sides of the war. But Johnny's success came at a cost, and the psychological toll of war would follow him and his fellow pilots for years to come. While his escape was a brilliant victory, it was also a reminder of the brutal reality of aerial combat. Each engagement, each dogfight, was a game of life and death, where even the smallest mistake could lead to disaster. And yet, for every pilot who escaped a swarm of Messerschmitts, there were others who did not. The human cost of the war was staggering, and the skies over Europe were littered with the wreckage of planes and the ghosts of men who would never return. The psychological impact of the war on the airmen, both on the Allies and the Axis, was profound. Johnny, like many of his fellow pilots, carried the weight of their experiences long after the war ended. The adrenaline, the fear, the brief moments of exhilaration, and the endless hours of waiting, it all took its toll. For every victory, there was a loss. And for every moment of triumph, there was a lingering question: who would be next? After the war, as part of the post-war assessments, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey analyzed the psychological impact of the air war on the Axis. They found that German pilots, once known for their disciplined aggression, had begun to suffer from a breakdown in morale. As the American tactics of surprise and unpredictability took hold, many Luftwaffe pilots began to doubt their ability to engage the Allies effectively. In interviews, they spoke of confusion, fear, and the frustration of never being able to predict the next move. Their once certain superiority in the air had become a source of deep anxiety. On the other side, the Allies had emerged victorious, but the cost of that victory was not only in lives, but in the toll it took on the men who fought it. A generation of pilots, like Johnny, returned home, forever changed by the battles they had fought. Some of them carried the weight of what they had done. Others, like Johnny, would struggle with the emotional scars of war. In interviews with veterans, many spoke of conflicting emotions they faced after the war. Relief mixed with grief, pride mixed with guilt. They had survived the war, but at what cost? The tactical legacy of Johnny's escape would last far longer than the psychological scars. As the world moved into the Cold War, the lessons learned in the skies over Europe would continue to shape military doctrine. Air superiority, it turned out, wasn't just about technology or firepower. It was about the ability to outthink the enemy, to remain unpredictable, and to force them into a position where they couldn't react fast enough. The rise of jet fighters and modern aerial warfare would build on these principles, evolving from the lessons learned in World War II. The ability to adapt and innovate in real time, just as Johnny had done, would become a core tenet of air combat strategy. Johnny's maneuver, though simple in concept, represented a revolution in thinking that would have ripple effects across every major conflict that followed. It demonstrated that success in the air wasn't just about flying faster or shooting straighter. It was about thinking differently, about knowing when to break from convention and take the fight to the enemy in unexpected ways. This mindset would permeate every aspect of military strategy, from the Cold War to modern-day drone warfare. In the skies above Europe, Johnny's escape had set a precedent that would shape the future of air combat for generations. When Johnny returned home after the war, he was hailed as a hero. Yet, the true measure of his contribution wasn't just in the lives he saved or the victories he achieved. It was in the new way of thinking he had brought to aerial combat. He had shown the world that adaptability, creativity, and courage were just as vital to victory as strength and firepower. In doing so, Johnny had altered the course of history in the skies and beyond. As the years passed, Johnny would reflect on that day in 1943, when his Mustang had swirled through the chaos of Messerschmitt swarms, and how that one maneuver had helped shift the tide of air combat. But he also knew that the battle wasn't just about the aircraft they flew or the moves they made. It was about the men who flew them, the engineers who built them, and the countless others who made it all possible. The war in the air had been won not by any one person or any one plane, but by a collective effort that spanned nations, industries, and generations. In the end, Johnny's secret maneuver, once a desperate tactic in a life-or-death moment, had become a symbol of the unyielding spirit of those who fought in the skies. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, innovation and courage could change the course of history. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies had been shattered, not by overwhelming numbers or superior firepower, but by the ingenuity and adaptability of a few brave men who refused to fight by the enemy's rules.